Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about Swedish research. In particular, we're going to talk about the immigrants from Sweden into the United States and how to trace them back into Sweden. And then we'll take a look at some of the more than 86 million Swedish records available on Ancestry.com. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's talk first about what you need to know about Swedish immigration and what you need to know about your Swedish ancestors in the United States before you can make use of the Swedish records available on our website. Let's just first talk about when people came, so that you know that you're working with the right people. Prior to 1790, there were only about 500 Swedes that immigrated to America, and they very quickly assimilated. And some of the things they brought with them have affected our culture. And the estimate is that there's more than 2 million people who descend from that original group of Swedes, but it was a really limited number. And then there were not actually hardly any Swedes that are trackable that immigrated after that time period until just about 1840. The economy was really good in Sweden. They had excellent food and resources, and people were living well and long, and so there just wasn't a need felt for people to leave Sweden. Now, in the 1840s, what started happening is because people were living longer and healthier lives, what happened is that these families, these large families, could only divide their farms so many times among their children, and so they started running out of land. And so we see this peak of immigration start again in about 1841, right up until about the beginning of the U.S. Civil War in 1863. And then it drops off again until about 1880 or so. And then we see it pick back up again. Huge wave of immigration in the 1880s. 325,000 people immigrated from Sweden to America. And in total, about 1.2 million that came altogether. So there were these waves of immigration, and that's important to understand, just so that you know when and where you're looking. There's also a typical route that people took in immigration, and that's important to understand because it helps you know where to go to look for passenger lists. During that peak immigration period in the 1880s, the route that most took was from Gothenburg, Sweden to England, and then they would switch ships and get on another ship to cross the Atlantic. And so we see here they cross the North Sea, usually landing in Hull, and then going cross country, probably by train, to either Liverpool or down to Southampton, and then sailing on a ship across the Atlantic that way. What that means is that you're going to probably find some of these people on multiple passenger lists. Okay. There are outbound passenger lists or outgoing passenger lists for England, and those are available on Ancestry if you have an international subscription. There are also Gothenburg passenger lists, so you'll find people leaving those countries. And then there are inbound passenger lists, of course, for the United States, and those are available if you have a U.S. subscription. So outbound out of Sweden and or out of England, and then inbound into the U.S. So theoretically, and I have proven this to be true, you could find any single passenger on 3 successive passenger lists as they cross from Sweden to England and then into the United States. Now, of course, the hope is that they survive on at least just one of the passenger lists so that you have that information available to you. Excuse me. Now let's talk about where they ended up once they got to the United States. Though a lot of them, the majority of them came through eastern ports, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore being the major ports that Swedish immigration occurred through. They did not stay, for the most part, in the eastern United States. The majority of Swedish immigrants went into what we call the American heartland and settled in Illinois and Minnesota. And according to recent U.S. Census data, about 4 million Americans define themselves as Swedish by heritage. And you can see on this map here the heavy concentration in the red, a little bit lighter concentration in the pink and then yellow, where you're going to see pockets or large populations of Swedish immigrants and then Swedish descendants today. So, what does all that mean for you researching your Swedish family history? It means that you need to make sure you exhaust all U.S. resources first. It's very tempting to want to jump immediately into finding somebody on a passenger list or immediately into Swedish records to see what you can find. But there are some challenges with Swedish research, and we'll talk about those here in just a minute, that require that you do as much research in U.S. sources first. So, make sure that you have collected every U.S. census in which this particular ancestor or this particular family is enumerated. Particularly, you're going to be looking at things like immigration year and naturalization status. Those exist on every census from 1900 through 1930. So make sure you make note of that. They won't always be consistent for a couple of reasons, but collecting all of the censuses should help at least give you a range or a time period to search. If they were naturalized, that information will be on the U.S. federal census, again, from 1900 to 1930, that is noted. It will say AL, which means they're still an alien citizen, PA, meaning they have submitted papers or a declaration of intent to become a U.S. citizen, or NA, which means they have become naturalized. If they were naturalized, then your next step is to look for those naturalization papers. There is a complete packet of naturalization, not just a certificate, not just an index card. What you're looking for is the declaration of intent and the petition to naturalize. And that can be anywhere from 2 to 4 pages long. And it has a lot of really rich details, especially the later in time you get. So if they naturalized, after 1900, chances are you're going to have some really rich details on that, including possibly the date, the port, and the ship of arrival. Now, prior to 1922, only males, adult males, had to naturalize or were naturalized. Let me word that better. If a head of household naturalized, his spouse and children automatically derived citizenship. So women could naturalize, but if they were married and their husband became a U.S. citizen, they didn't need to. So very often what you're going to find is only naturalization paperwork for the husband or father of a family, because his spouse and underage children derive their citizenship from him prior to 1922. Okay, so when you're looking for that naturalization paperwork, you might not find great grandmas, but look for great grandpas. Okay, that'll give you the information that you need. Another clue on census records is the birthplaces of the children. When you're dealing with some of these families, we'll talk about chain migration here in just a minute, but what happens is you often end up with this varying year of immigration showing up on census records, but the birthplaces of the children are usually a really good clue about exactly when they immigrated. If you have 2 or 3 children born in Sweden, and then the next couple of children born in the United States, that gives you a really specific time frame for when the family migrated or immigrated. And if it was a chain migration situation, it gives you a clear picture of when the parents parted and when they were back together again. So timelines become your friend, particularly when you're doing immigration research. Now, once you have done all that census work, located the naturalization paperwork, now you can look at passenger lists. Passenger lists, and let me just show you where you're going to find those on Ancestry. We have both outbound, as I mentioned, and inbound passenger lists. The outbound passenger lists, if I come into the card catalog, and for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's the bottom option on your search menu. So you're going to want to come to the card catalog, and that's going to allow you to locate a specific database to search. So for example, if I type in Sweden into the card catalog, I'll see a list of all 15 Swedish databases containing all 86 million some odd records that we have for Sweden. But one of the databases that's going to come up on my list is the Gothenburg, Sweden passenger lists. Okay. This particular set of passenger lists contains 1.2 million records. It covers 1869 through 1951. And I can then just search this particular set of passenger lists here. Because there are images attached, I can also browse them if I so choose. So if I happen to know a specific year and month and ship that my ancestor traveled on, I can go directly to that specific passenger list, and then using the little page navigation tools down here in the bottom center, I can go page by page looking for them. Now, these passenger lists are in Swedish, as are all of our Swedish records. And don't let that deter you, okay? One of the greatest tools that I use when doing foreign research is Google Translate. So you just go to translate.google.com, and it takes you to the Google Translate page, and then you can take any phrase or word or piece of information off of this particular passenger list or any record, and you can type it directly into Google Translate, and it will translate it for you into English. Now, one of the things that I also like to do whenever I do any foreign language genealogy research, particularly where I am not familiar with the language, is I will just create a little master list of words that I can print out and set next to my computer, so that as I'm working with these records, I start to recognize some of these words. And so I'll just use, I'll just go through and do some basic relationship words, child, son, daughter. I'll do some basic genealogical event words, so birth or born, marriage, death, died, burial. I'll just go through and just create a whole list of common words in family history, and you can see as I type the word here in the English side, it automatically over here translates it on the Swedish side. And then I can just copy and paste that into a Word document, and then print that out, like I said, and keep it next to my computer, so that as I work with these records, I know what some of these things mean. So, passenger list, immigrant, ship, whatever the words are that you need to understand or think you might encounter, you can actually create a preemptive list. Now, you can, like I said, you can also then come in here and type in anything you find that you don't understand, so that you can understand what those words mean. The records will be in Swedish. Can't emphasize that enough. Some people get a little surprised by that. They think, well, how come these records haven't been translated? Well, we're just presenting you with the original record. So if you're searching for Carl Larsson, he'll come up from Homestead, 31 years old, and over here it tells you where they're headed to, and really great information on these passenger lists, but you have to understand what those column headings mean. So those are the Gothenburg passenger lists, 1869 to 1951, 1.2 million passengers left Sweden. Okay. We also have, as I mentioned, the outbound, I never remember what they're called. I think they're called outbound passenger lists for England. There's an easier way to find them here. If I just click on passenger lists. The outbound passenger lists from England, from the UK. So I can click on passenger lists, outward. That's why I can't ever remember it. Okay, so we have the UK outward passenger lists from 1890 through 1960. And there are 23.7 million records in that particular database. And so I could come here and I could actually search then. Remember, people went from Sweden to England, and then from England on to the United States. And so, again, I can just do a search here, for Carl Larsson, or I can actually browse that particular set of records. And it'll tell you very often detailed information on these passenger lists about who they are and where they're from, and sometimes it's just really basic information. And so sometimes you get lucky and have a lot of information, and sometimes it's really simple. And so one of the cautions that I have for you, and one of the reasons why it's so important that you do all that census and naturalization work first, is because one of the challenges with Swedish research is that they don't have a lot of variation in names. And so that's the challenge with a lot of different ethnic research is not a lot of variation in names. And so you have to make sure you have the right person. And sometimes the only way to know you have the right person is to have done other kinds of research so that you can connect the dots. So, if I did a search just on Carl Larson, you see here I have 385 possibilities. And so if I had no clue when he came or how old he was or, what port he may have left from or where he came in, right? The more information I have, the more likely I am to be certain that when I find a passenger list, it's for the person I'm actually looking for. So those are the outward passenger lists out of the UK. So we have outward out of Gothenburg, outward out of the UK. And then, of course, we have the inbound passenger lists for the United States. In particular, we have the New York passenger lists, and that doesn't just cover Ellis Island. Ellis Island didn't open until 1892, so if your ancestor came before that, they would have come into Castle Garden, or prior to Castle Garden, it would have just been the Port of New York. After Ellis Island closed, they came into JFK, and included in this are some airline passenger lists if your immigrant ancestor happened to come after air travel. So 82.9 million records in that particular database. But don't just get hung up on New York unless you have some kind of evidence that your ancestor immigrated through New York. Realize there were lots of ways into the United States. They could come in to Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore. They could come into Canada and then cross the border into the United States. It just depends on what was the available passage at the time for them. So of course the majority did come into New York, but if you're not finding them in that one, be sure to look around. Now, when you're looking at passenger lists, what you're looking specifically for is information about birthplace and or last residence. Sometimes that information is very explicitly stated on a record. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have to look at who they're traveling with and see if you can find information about where that person was from. And usually they're going to be, very often you find people from the same community traveling together. One of the things listed on some passenger lists is who they're going to join. Who are they coming to in the United States and who they left behind. Swedes were one of the groups of people who engaged in what we call chain migration. Chain migration simply means that a member of the family would migrate or immigrate, and then they would send for other members of the family. And so usually what you see is, a teenage or young adult son, maybe with his new bride, immigrating to the United States, finding a place, becoming established, sending then for maybe the father and some of the teenage children, and then sending later for the mother and the younger children. And so sometimes you'll see these waves of a single family immigrating over the course of 1, 2, 3, 5 years. It just kind of depends. That makes it a little bit challenging, though. Well, it makes it great because you get this then who are they joining, who's left behind information on the passenger list, but it makes it a little challenging sometimes because if you've got, teenage boys or a head of household immigrating one person at a time, it makes it a little more difficult to make sure you've got the right person on the passenger list. When you have multiple people on a passenger list in a family, you have a greater certainty that you've got the right people. But where you have just one person traveling on a passenger list, you have to be really careful that you've identified the correct person. And so that who they're joining, who they left behind information, where it exists on passenger lists is important. That also means anytime you look at a passenger list, always make sure you look at the next page just to make sure there's not additional information that it wasn't across 2 pages of a ledger when the information was recorded. Also consider passport applications. Swedes, probably more than a lot of other immigrant groups, returned to Sweden. As a matter of fact, the numbers vary, but I think the latest number I heard is that about a third of Swedish immigrants at some point returned to Sweden, some to stay. And so what we see happen is if they had become a U.S. citizen, or if it was a period of time where the law required that they needed papers to travel, then they may have applied for a passport. And so Ancestry.com has those passport applications available online. You might want to check out that database. So if you just type in passport in the card catalog, you'll see those U.S. passport applications through 1925. That's all that's been made publicly available. And there's about 1.8 million records there. So you can go in there and see if they applied for a passport. That passport application will include citizenship information, sometimes immigration information. Almost certainly, though, it will include information about where specifically they are going to visit in Sweden. And very often that's going to be their hometown, which is what you're looking for. Really, that is the single piece of information. I mean, besides the story of the family and the information that you're collecting along the way, the single piece of information that you're most looking for in this process so that you can further your Swedish research is a specific location. It's great to say your ancestors were Swedish, but it's better to say that they were from Karlstad or from Stockholm or from Helmstedt or wherever. If you know a specific location, you're going to be much, much more successful when you start digging into Swedish records. So always be on the lookout for that specific location where they were from, where they were born. That's the piece of information. Now, we've kind of covered this, but I just want to give you kind of a quick refresher, and then we'll start looking at some of these Swedish records specifically. Always think broader than just the immigrant. Sometimes we get tunnel vision looking for a person, but consider them and their spouse and their children and grandchildren, their siblings, their nieces and nephews, their friends and neighbors and associates, who are the witnesses on their children's baptisms and the sponsors for confirmations, and who are they doing land transactions with. All of that. All of those people, especially when you start getting into some of these tight-knit Swedish communities in Illinois and Minnesota, what you're going to see is that very often those communities of people that formed here in the United States are based off of communities that they had lived in Sweden. And so very often the people they associate with aren't just Swedish, they're from a specific place in Sweden where your ancestor also was from. So don't get tunnel vision. Just if you can't find the information you're looking for about your immigrant that you're looking for, broaden your horizons and start looking at other people in their life. Even if those children and grandchildren were born here in the United States, very often I've seen biographies or obituaries or articles written up about some of these people that said, their grandfather was an immigrant from, and then it lists the name of the town. So sometimes you have to expand your research in order to take your research back other generations. There are going to be other records that are going to have sometimes that specific location information available, particularly death records, newspapers, family and local histories. All of those are things that you can find on Ancestry.com. Hopefully they exist for the time and place you're interested in. If not, contact local libraries where your ancestor may have lived. Excuse me. Okay, now let's just review some of the challenges of Swedish research. We talked about chain migration. It's not really a challenge, it's just something I want you to be aware of, that you may have single males and single females immigrating on passenger lists alone, and so you need to be really careful that you've got the right person. When it's multiple people in a family traveling together, it increases the likelihood that you've got the right people. But when it's one at a time, that chain migration pattern, you need to make sure you're looking at the right people and collecting the right information. So always analyze that passenger list in the context of everything else you've collected about this person. I mentioned common names earlier. You have a lot of, or a small pool of names for a large group of people, and so you see names repeated and a lot of people with the same name, and so you want to make sure that the Carl Larson or the Peter Johnson that you're looking at is your person, not somebody else with the same name. Again, that means you're going to collect as much information about them and their family structure and information as you can, so that you can compare all of that and make sure there's no outliers or oddball pieces of information. Another challenge with Swedish research is that for a very long time, Swedes use the patronymic naming system. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, what that means is that instead of a surname being passed from father to son, or father to children, for example, I'm a Cowan, my father was a Cowan, his father was a Cowan, they would actually change their last name with each generation based on a patronymic naming system. So Carl Larsson's children, his son then may be named Peter Carlson. And Peter Carlson's son then may become Lars Peterson. And Lars Peterson's son may then become, Peter Larsson. And so now every generation has a different last name. The beauty of that, or the benefit of that, of course, is that in the last name you now know the first name of the father, but you don't know the last name of the father. And so once you get into the rhythm of it, it makes research kind of fun. But if you're not familiar with how that naming system works, you just need to be aware of that. Now, this is not obviously a blanket statement, but most of the Swedish immigrants dropped the patronymic naming system once they immigrated to the United States or shortly thereafter. Some of them even may have had patronymic names upon immigration, and then when they got to the United States, the entire family may have taken on a common name. And so you end up with some name change issues as well. So a family, Peter Larsson's family may have all immigrated as, John and Lars and Peter with their father's then patronymic name. But then when they got to the United States, they may have taken on their father's last name. And so you need to be aware. Patronymic naming system, most often discontinued when they arrived or shortly after they arrived in the United States, but there may be some name changes that occur in the process. And so, again, collecting all the information you can about a family is going to give you the information about family structure and ages and birthplaces, so that when you find new clues or new pieces of information, you can be sure you've got the right people. And then I mentioned earlier, returning family members. You do end up with people who go back to Sweden. So just because somebody disappears off a census, don't assume that they died. It's possible that they went back to Sweden. So let's talk about Swedish records. I make a point of making sure you understand all of that, because it's really important that you don't just try to jump straight into the Swedish records, that you've done your research back to that point appropriately. So we're going to use the card catalog to discover what exists online at Ancestry.com. Particularly, there are Sweden has amazing, excellent records, okay? So once you get into the Swedish records and you know the place where your ancestor is from, you have a gold mine. You have a gold mine of information. It ties families together beautifully. You don't just have birth, marriage, and death records that go back for an extended period of time, but you also have household examinations, moving in and moving out registers, and so you can track families' movements, and it's just fantastic. Really excellent records. So once you get to this point, then your family history research could just explode. You can end up with more people in your tree than you know what to do with. So let's just do a quick search in the card catalog here for Sweden. Now we're back to those 15 Swedish databases that I mentioned earlier. And the first one is a database containing 35 million records, and it's the Swedish church records. And yes, you're reading that correctly. They date back to 1500. Sweden has some of the earliest known contiguous record sets of any country. And so, like I said, once you get into these records, you're going to find some really great things. They are in Swedish. I would strongly encourage you, like I do with all new databases or records that you're getting interested in, scroll down past that search box, and we have provided you with some detailed information about these Swedish church records. So information about where they came from, how they're organized, information about what's included in each of the different kinds of records, including some basic translations for the different kinds of record, the different record types, so that you know what it is that you're looking at. Okay, so birth, marriage, and death records are, of course, going to be the most prominent records in these kinds of, in this particular database. There's also going to be household examination rolls or clerical survey records. This is the bulk of the church registers. Okay, so what it is it's almost like a census, right? So every year people were there was a household examination held every year to help understand how people were following their religion or how they understood the catechism specifically. And so it would include everybody in the household, including children, and it would very often have a lot of details, including information about when and where they were born. Sometimes you'll see information about when they were married. You'll see information about when people moved in and moved out, or when they came to that particular farm. The whole family is listed together, so you have a household listed together. Anyway, just really, really detailed records, these household examinations. So it's like an annual census almost. Fantastic records. You also then have moving in and moving out registers. Anytime anybody moved into a parish or moved out of a parish, it was recorded. They kept track of what was happening with people. And the benefit of these moving in and out registers is that if somebody left to go to the United States, it's gonna have a notation about that. And again, that's gonna be a starting point for you, these moving in and out registers, to know you've got the right people at the right place at the right time. It will also record farm names, and farm names are another little interesting challenge for Swedish research. Sometimes people took on a farm name as a surname in the place of or in addition to a patronymic. And so knowing what farm they came from is, again, an important piece of genealogical information for doing research in Swedish records. So the moving in and moving out registers are really excellent. Included in this database description, we also give you information about how best to search these records. I would strongly encourage you to use the card catalog, come directly to this database, read about how to search them the most effective way, and then practice some of those searches on your specific family members based on the information that you know. We have provided you with a search form here that is specific to this particular collection of records. One of the things you'll notice is there is not a place to search by name. It's about locations specifically. Now you can browse to specific locations. So for example, if I knew a specific county and parish where my family was from, and I knew a specific record type that I wanted to look at because I knew that my family left this particular place on a certain date, I could come directly to this set of records and then again just go page by page through them until I found the records that I was interested in. Again, remember they're going to be in Swedish, so you might need to use Google Translate to translate these column headings so that you have those available to you as you understand what the information is that you are looking at. So that is the best way to use these Swedish church records. Again, there's 35 million of them, and they are a gold mine. If once you figure out how to use them, you'll find that your Swedish research just doesn't end until you get back to the 1500s. We also have baptisms back to the 1600s, and some birth records, indexes of birth records back to 1860. Some death indexes, those are more modern death indexes, and then the marriage records, and I think this is a fairly large collection, if I remember correctly, about 2.3 million marriages dating back to 1630 and 1.9 million burials dating back to 1649. Again, always read that database description so that you are aware of what it is that you're doing, what it is that you're looking at, so that you have some information before you dive in and start searching. You'll find your searches are a lot more successful that way. One final piece of advice, if the records you're finding aren't online, let me try that again. If you're looking for records and not finding them, or if you are, dive into this and are still feeling a little overwhelmed, we have excellent message boards on Ancestry.com. You're going to find those under the Collaborate tab. So if you just go to Collaborate and then Message Boards, there are Swedish message boards. So if you want to learn more about how to do research in Swedish records, go to some of the Swedish area message boards. and post your queries. Lots of really, really helpful people who have mastered the art of Swedish research that are willing to give you further assistance and further guidance, help you understand a little bit more about what it is that you're looking at, what it is that you're looking for, and how best to discover it. The Swedish records are pretty detailed, and so if you're not finding something or if you're getting confused, it's usually just a matter of getting yourself a little bit of extra help from somebody who understands the records, because in my experience anyway, the records are almost always there. It's just a matter of getting into them the right way or finding the right pieces of information. So that was your beginning Swedish research overview. If you'd like more details on that, as I said, please reach out to people on the message boards. If you have specific questions, I will be on chat in just a few minutes to answer what additional questions I can, or leave some comments if you're watching this on YouTube, and we will respond to those as necessary. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.